Now, the South African Human Rights Commission has expressed concern over the number of complaints it receives on the ongoing arrest of cannabis users. That's despite cannabis being decriminalized in the country. The Commission says it has written to the SAPS National Commissioner, Fannie, Masemola, to raise their grievances. They believe that any arrest or prosecution could lead to human rights violation. For more on this, I'm joined by Muti founder, Tebogo Tlhopane. Tebogo, thank you so much for the time, and I appreciate it here on Newzroom. Please help me understand this a little bit better, and perhaps we can hopefully get the SA Human Rights Commission as well on this. According to the Cannabis for Private Purposes Act of 2020, it speaks about being able to use, cultivate, and really partake in cannabis in private. So is this really saying then that these arrests are also happening in people's private homes? Because if it is in public, that's the one where, of course, it isn't allowed, because non-agreeing or children who are inundated with inhalation of cannabis, that is still a criminal offense.
100%. And thank you, Arabile, for having me. And hi to the viewers at home. If you recall, Arabile, in 2018, the Constitutional Court decriminalized the private use, possession, and cultivation of cannabis for adults. And at the same time, we then had, subsequent to that, of course, after some while longer, we have a Cannabis for Private People's Bill or Act of this year. And there was subsequent meetings at Pakisa, of which in August last year, a directive was issued by SAPS, which will stop or have a moratorium on arrests for cannabis-related activities or private use context. Now, the reason I say all these things is that what's happening right now is clearly a marginalization of groups like the Rastafari, and more so the disregard by SAPS for the judicial rulings that we have, as well as human rights. So the Human Rights Commission is right in actually, fielding these questions towards SAPS, because as it stands, it's completely legal what they're doing.
Yeah, and I think that's why my questioning was really around whether these arrests are happening in people's private homes. And if the question then is also about cultivation, and I want to go to the bill then that we're speaking about, so that nothing here is assumed to have been said incorrectly. An adult person who in a private place cultivates more than the prescribed quantity contemplated in section 2(1)(b, but less than a trafficable quantity of cannabis plants, is guilty of a Class C offense. Now, the Act and the bill does not speak about what exactly is a prescribed quantity and what exactly is a trafficable quantity of cannabis. Does that need to be also then be made clear for cultivation's sake in people's private homes?
100%. As much as we have this private people's bill that's out there, the meat on the bone hasn't been put in place that will then address these issues regarding how much possession one should have, how much possession one should have at the private places, and it's private spaces. It's not necessarily, private space can be anything, Arabile. It cannot just be your home, right? Which also put into question the ability for people that don't have private spaces, for them to still have access to cannabis. And if you look at your marginalized communities, as we're speaking about the Rastafari, it's the same issue. That if someone cannot grow cannabis in their own private spaces, or they don't have private spaces, what do they then do, Arabile? And as things stand, there isn't anything in place, at least from a government side. But from the users, people that are using cannabis for whatever reason that they're using it for, there are things in place like your cannabis social clubs, which really sits at the back of the constitutional ruling, as well as, aligning with the Cannabis for Private People's Bill.
Yeah, and of course many concerns around just where exactly access is really or could really be found at this time. How do we address this then properly? Do we then need to re-look at the bill, add meat to the bones, as you've just said as well? Do we then just have to have this conversation as the SAHRC is trying to have then with police and law enforcement? Because maybe the understanding of the bill has actually not been made correct at this stage.
Well, I think the main thing for us is that we've had this conversation at Pakisa last year in June, of which all stakeholders were invited: Rastafari, the government departments, even the Department of Justice, as well as SAPS. We had brigadiers there. And one of the things that we've agreed that must be done was the removal of cannabis from the Drugs Act. And this will enable a broader industry participation, recognizing the indigenous knowledge system and the role of legacy farmers. As you know, South Africa has the oldest history of using cannabis, oldest. Implementation of regulatory sandboxes to test the pathways of transitioning from illicit growers into legal economy. Remember, we're talking about a substance where many countries around the world is legal now. It's been commercialized now. And we need to take advantage of all these things, as opposed to looking at SAPS quota systems that they use to arrest people. Cannabis must be removed from that altogether. And there must be some stricter way of how they must enforce their own directive to make sure that the police are actually following it. Arabile. And at the moment, it's not the case.
Are we saying, however, that all users, ultimately all those that have been arrested as well with regards to cannabis-related arrests, that they've been blameless in this situation? Because surely then there needs to be a level here in which we also scrutinize that, and that could then be of concern too, if any, of course.
Well, I think the issue is we got to urge the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development to expedite regulations under the Cannabis for Private Purpose Act to provide clarity on the permissible limits for private cultivation and possession. We have to call immediate reinforcement of this moratorium directive to halt these unjust arrests and ensure compliance with both legal and operational framework. And this is not about cannabis. It's about human rights, economic inclusion, and honoring the commitments made at Pakisa to transition South Africa into a global leader in this sector. And we can be. Our climate is fantastic. We've got great history.
Yeah.
And IKS, indigenous knowledge of how to grow cannabis. I mean, they're growing it at Mampondo, Lusikisiki, in areas where you wouldn't even imagine that it grows. And they survive even the spraying by the police, where they were mass murdering people with cancer with this, with spraying of cannabis. So all of these things are facts that, and as a country with our history of apartheid, it makes no sense that we still had the apartheid law that stayed until this long.
Yeah. How does this all impact dispensaries like yourselves, especially medical marijuana and cannabis dispensaries like Muti and some others, of course?
Well, you got to look at it this way. There isn't any legal framework for cannabis sales in South Africa. There isn't. The only thing that you have is, if you're looking at the medicinal side, you're then looking at your Section 21, which is an application that you do to our regulatory SAPRA for the doctors to then be able to prescribe cannabis for you. And that's a case-by-case basis, and it costs about 340 rand. So it's already exclusion. Now, when you're looking at people that want to have access to cannabis, for whatever reason they want to have access to, they're adults, by the way, there is then the social club models, which were created at the back of the constitutional ruling of 2018, and they are aligned with the Cannabis for Private Purpose Bill. And these are the things that have been around. Countries like Spain have successfully run these programs. And these are the things that I believe should be what drives our industry going forward. What creates accessibility of cannabis to those who don't have access to private spaces.
Yeah.
As we know, it's your constitutional right. It's in the Constitution.
True.
So by creating or piggybacking on these social cannabis clubs, which I think is a lower-hanging fruit that the Department of Justice can equally jump on and make sure that people can then participate in that space. and control, taxes, the whole thing.
Yeah. A lot of issues still at play. Like you said, not enough meat on the bones of the bill and the act then thus far. So clearly, a relook is going to be necessary, but it is a new bill when one considers as well the time span. So a lot of conversation still to be had. Tebogo, appreciate the time. Tebogo Tlhopane is Muti founder there as we just really talk about police and the SAPS in particular are making arrests for cannabis-related arrests, that is, for people in possession of cannabis as well. So concerns around that.